Hello, once again. So I know most of what we're focusing on this week is just making the transition from doing short stories to now looking at poetry. But in this video, I wanted to address some of the historical context of the poems that we're going to read. So I think I mentioned in my other video that all of the poems that we're looking at are going to be related to the American Civil Rights Movement, right? So when we think of civil rights movement, what comes to mind? Probably first thing is like Martin Luther King, right? Maybe his "I Have a Dream" speech, different protests, the Rosa Parks bus boycott, things like that. So I just wanted to give us some of the like big historical events and moments from this time period, and then I also want to kind of maybe critique a little bit uh, the normal telling of the historical events. And this I'm kind of going to be previewing one of the essays I have for homework, though, making civil rights harder. That essay that really delves into the kind of like why the story of the civil rights movement, like why we tell it the way that we do. Um, so a few of these things I want to highlight. Number one, I think that usually viewed as kind of the start of the civil rights movement. 1954, you have the Supreme Court decision, Brown versus the Board of Ed. This is the decision that made school segregation illegal, um, where they then like desegregated schools, and you might have seen the way they had to send in like the National Guard and stuff to protect these students and like make sure that like everyone went along with it and things. So that's 1954. In 1964, you have the Voting Rights Act, which got rid of things like a poll tax and a literacy test to have to vote. So this one, the Voting Rights Act, and then also the Civil Rights Act of 1965, are kind of seen as like the legislative achievements of the civil rights movement. The Civil Rights Act of 1965 addressed things like discrimination by employers or by banks giving loans. It made it against the law to say I'm not hiring you because of your race. Um, so that's 1965. Martin Luther King gives his "I Have a Dream" speech in 1963, and that's when the March on Washington is. So, like, I think the way that we usually tell this is like starting with Brown versus Board of Ed, and also Rosa Parks. I think is around that in like the mid 50s. So we look at that as kind of the start, and then we have this decade of kind of different protests and boycotts and things like that. The March on Washington, the "I Have a Dream" in 1963, and then 1964, the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act after that. And then the way that we kind of just had to tell it as like the story ends there, right? Like, wow, we did it. So like I think there's a way, like the kind of popular telling of this story as something very isolated, something that happened over a 10-year period, and that was ultimately successful. I think it's really important, like in the way history tends to present the civil rights movement, that we see it as being a success, and achieving what it needed to achieve. And I think that is kind of one, like not really true. I think there's a lot of people at the time, as we'll see, who after 1965 kind of looked at this and were like, this is nothing, like this is not what we were protesting for. This is not what we thought we needed. And then in 1968, Martin Luther King is assassinated. Um, so like I don't know. I think it's kind of too easy, too simple, maybe to look at it as just like this like short movement that got what it needed to get. Um, so like the essay that we're going to read makes the argument that we need to kind of expand how we think of this, right? Because like protests against racial inequality didn't start in the 1950s. It's not the first time that happened. It's not like in the 30s, like just everyone was like, oh yeah, everything, it's fine, it's totally fine, everyone was totally on board. Like, no, there's been some level of protest, or sometimes outright revolt, from the beginning of slavery in America. There's been some kind of pushback against the different kinds of treatments of different races in America. So to expand our timeline a little bit, In terms of slavery in the U.S., you can go back to 1619 with like Jamestown and Virginia and stuff like that when the English were doing their first colonies. Um, and then right after that, you have something like in 1675, you have an event known as Bacon's Rebellion, which was a revolution where they actually burned down a lot of Jamestown. It was a pretty serious revolt on the very young Virginia colony, where what happened and why I think it's a notable point in the movement of civil rights is that Bacon's Rebellion was kind of this case where you had slaves, and then you had white, like I guess we call them indentured servants a lot of the time, but at this point they weren't really indentured servants. They were basically also slaves, who were white, who were doing the same work as the slaves in terms of the agriculture or doing heavy lifting and things like this. And they were basically treated just as bad as the slaves, but they were white. And what you had in Bacon's Rebellion was this kind of, the lowest class, both black and white, coming together and really having a revolt against the owners, against the masters, the people who were telling them to do the farming, who were not really paying them, um, and who were ultimately the ones making the money from the labor of the farming and stuff like that. So yeah, it was this pretty successful revolt in that they burned Jamestown, where you had like basically essentially white slaves and black slaves coming together and revolting against the wealthier people there. And then I think this is an important moment because after Bacon's Rebellion, what their response to this was not to stop treating everybody so bad, right? Like, oh wow, if people are going to revolt, I guess we should treat them better. It was to try to kind of divide the white slaves from the black slaves by creating the class of like indentured servant, where now if you were white, there were certain rules, like you couldn't you couldn't be whipped in public. I think was one of them, and you had to have a contract. You had to be free after a certain number of years. So essentially, their response to this was to like slightly elevate, the former white slaves and now make them indentured servants who eventually would be free and could get out, and had certain other privileges to try to, head off any possibility of them coming together to revolt the way that they had in Bacon's Rebellion. So that's 1675. Moving ahead in history, 1791, you have the Haitian Revolution, which, even though this didn't strictly happen in America, right? Haiti is island south of America. I think it's an important moment because it shows us like just how much of a through line this has been through history. So the Haitian Revolution, 1791. Haiti was a colony of France at the time, and it was one of the most valuable colonies in the world in terms of sugar production, which was extremely valuable at that time because you could make rum, and you could make all kinds of treats. Um, and it was hard to find. So Haiti was at the time it was called Saint Domingue. It was a French colony, and it was a brutal place. Like probably, if you were one of the workers, one of the slaves, like that was probably one of the worst places on the planet to be in terms of conditions and danger and getting diseases or getting hurt in terms of cutting sugar and stuff. And what happened there is, the slaves revolted against the masters. They burned the plantations. They fought a war. They kicked them out. France tried to fight them back. Spain tried to fight them. America tried to fight them. And the Haitian revolutionaries, they won. They won the country. It's now Haiti. That's when it became Haiti. Was after this. So I do think it's important, though, that we see all these things as kind of part of the same movement, of trying to move towards more like racial equality and getting rights for Black people. So one more old historical example here, 1831. You have another revolt led by Nat Turner. This is another famous, pretty successful one of a bunch of slaves getting together and killing the masters, burning the houses, taking over territory. And this one eventually is put down. But like I think it's important that we see the history of like revolt and protest. Like I think it's important that we see Nat Turner and the Haitian Revolution as part of the same thing that was going on with Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks and Malcolm X. Like it's a straight line through history of people resisting slavery, resisting oppression, fighting back against it, protesting, revolting, rioting. That really goes up until the modern day, right? There's no reason that we need to stop at 1965. It's not like these things ended there. You can look at things like Rodney King in the 90s, or even in 1968 is when you have riots in places like Newark. After Martin Luther King is killed, you have famously the riots in Newark. Um, so like 1965 with the Civil Rights Act is not the end of this story either. It goes to those things. It goes into the 90s. It goes into Black Lives Matter and like people like Trayvon Martin and things like this, like police, was always a part of it too, going back to Nat Turner through to the 50s through to now. So the argument in this essay is that the civil rights movement should be viewed as having a much more expansive timeline, right? Starting all the way back at the beginning of slavery and going towards today. Because there was also a very vibrant movement of abolitionism in America, of not just slaves directly rioting, revolting, protesting, but also white people as well who were against slavery, who assembled as kind of a political movement to try to end slavery, and who had like newspapers and propaganda and stuff to try to influence people to get them to get rid of slavery. So yeah, it seems like we'd be doing a historical like disservice to just look at 1954 to 1965. That's the civil rights movement. I just don't think it makes sense to look at it that way. I think it needs to be viewed as this much longer movement throughout history that goes up until the present day. Um, and yeah, I think that reframes how we look at this history in an important way. And I'll talk about that more once we read the essay. I think that's all that I need to say for now. But yeah, I just wanted to give us some specific historical events that we could point to and some sense of how the poetry that we're reading fits into this. Because like you'll see, the first two poems that we're reading come from outside that usual time period. Kitchenette Building is like 1945, and it's very clearly a civil rights poem, but it's from the 40s. And Harlem, I think, is 1951. That's one of the most famous civil rights poems, The Dream Deferred. You might have read that before. So, one of the most famous civil rights poems comes from 1951, before the movement supposedly even started, right? So I think that kind of shows us that the kind of narrow historical perspective of this 10-year period where it's all MLK, that is just not really the actual history. So yes, hopefully we can kind of place the poems that we're going to look at in this kind of context. All right, I'll talk to you again later.